Great. Good morning, everyone. Dennis, thanks very much, and thanks very much to the organizers for the ability to participate this morning and have this discussion with you. I'd like to step back a bit and sort of take a more minimalist view, but also maybe a little broader view, rather than focusing as directly on TSCA itself, but rather on, what are some of the mechanisms we'd like to employ to safeguard the public from risks of chemicals. And I intend this as a thought starter for the discussion. And because it's at a higher level, that necessarily means some sweeping generalizations. I think that there were some of those in some of the earlier presentations before too, so you'll forgive me for those. I'd like to just start out by pointing out, if we're focused on information, I think we also have to be paying attention to the message we're sending. And I know this wasn't Richard's slide. He didn't create the second slide he had up with the nice graph that showed, thankfully, chemical production going up versus a baseline of population. But, that's in the abstract, that's a scary slide. It's like, oh my gosh, there's so many more chemicals out there and the population hasn't, is sort of leveling off and exposures must be going up. But there's a need to look kind of behind that information. I mean, first of all, it was comparing production value, a nominal figure versus a real figure like population. I mean, okay, hard to make comparisons there. But more important, that's evidence of economic growth. The World Bank says between 1970 and 2010, the world economy grew 3 times. This means we have a more affluent population. They are starting to demand the goods and services that improve the quality of their lives. Now, hopefully, our industry is providing the mechanism to ensure that they can enjoy the benefit of a longer, healthier life safely. So we as an industry have an incentive here to do that, but I think we want to make sure that the information we're putting out there is meaningful, it's relevant, and can be understood by those who use it in a particular case. So I think generally speaking, when we're talking about the use of information about chemicals, there's a wide range of points at which that information is relevant. One is clearly in the value chain. Businesses are making decisions about what products they use to confer a particular characteristic to get to a particular product or result. Another is clearly what information is sent to the government, what information EPA is relying on which to make decisions. And then there are clearly the public communications as well. In risk assessment, we have an information problem there of understanding what is the best available science that we're going to apply to make a decision on whether or not something is safe. In risk management, we have information requirements to understand, well, what are the options, the alternatives to a particular substance. We need additional information to understand what the costs and benefits of a particular regulatory path and how that stacks up in terms of what we're able to do. We also need information for compliance and enforcement. Now, so there's a host of issues here. Who gets the information? When do they get it? What are they getting? Is it use information? Is it ingredient information? Is it process information? And a lot of our focus more recently has been on the consumers, on on how do we protect consumers. There's a growing but not necessarily adequate body of information related to occupational or industrial exposures. And then even beyond that, we have to think about, are the interpretive tools available so that people can understand that information and apply it? What about the possibilities of unfair or just simply wrong conclusions to be drawn from that information? What's the societal impact of those conclusions? How do you do this in an efficient and effective way? How do we manage the frontier of science? I mean, I don't have to tell the IOM roundtable that the human body is still very much at the frontier of science. There's a lot about the human body we don't know. Richard very clearly set out that there's been a lot of developments in computational toxicology. we can now determine very quickly the potential impact of thousands of chemicals on a single cell in a very short period of time. As Richard noted, how do we know what the impact of that perturbation on the cell is for the organ, for the individual itself? And then how do we make policy decisions that affect the population on the basis of that information? So these are some of what I consider to be successes. Are they all unqualified successes? Absolutely not. I don't think there are any unqualified successes in this area, where the science is still developing along with the policy. But I think there has been some success in voluntary industry initiatives. In partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, the chemical industry did join in a program, the High Production Volume Challenge program, to produce certain screening level, to ensure that screening level information was available for the roughly 3,000 chemicals that represent the 95% of the volume of chemicals in U.S. commerce. That was a general success, I think. I think now the key is how do we use that information the right way. I think it's been part of certainly EPA's Work Plan Chemicals program. It's been a factor in deciding what are priorities. We have industry ingredient disclosure programs. You may have different views about their effectiveness. FRAC Focus, for example, on ingredients used in chemical ingredients used in hydraulic fracturing. The consumer product industry has, I think it's Clean Ingredient, I may have the name wrong. They have a web-based ingredient disclosure program. The ACC members and our colleagues in the International Council of Chemical Association have produced and have made available over the web about 2,200 safety summaries on major chemicals in commerce. These aren't intended to be highly technical documents. They're intended to be accessible to the public to generally describe what are some of the hazards, uses, and exposures of chemicals out there. There's a host of non-governmental standards out there that relate to chemical safety, and I won't go through all of them. One of them, I suppose you could argue whether it's a success or not, is the ANSI Greener Chemicals Standard, ANSI 355, developed by a group of stakeholders to encourage business-to-business discussions about what are the safety or sustainability considerations that are most important and that a customer could use to encourage a dialogue with the manufacturer. And then, of course, there's, I think, a host of government regulatory actions that I generally consider to be successes. Again, the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard does put some necessary information out and make it available to employees. There are state programs, a growing number of state programs that also look to make information more available. Wendy mentioned the ChemView program. That'll be followed by some additional enhancements, I think, later on, and that will put some, I think, powerful analytical tools in the hands of even the general public. I think the new chemicals program is generally a success. Richard's correct. The EPA doesn't have every bit of information about every new chemical that comes in, but that doesn't mean that EPA is operating in an information vacuum. They've got 37 years of experience. They've got some great scientists over there in the program who are able to make reasoned judgments about whether or not a new chemical can be put on the market. And I think the key point here is that, you know, when we're talking about information on chemicals, it's not just a single source. There is no single source of information. And we've got to consider ways in which we can best tap those various sources. Now, in terms of areas for potential areas for improvement, one is, you know, when and what information should be disclosed in the value chain. If safer chemistry is the goal, I think we have to be clear about what's safer. I think we have to create mechanisms that encourage that flow of information. REACH has done that to some extent in Europe, and there's the possibility that TSCA reform could have a similar effect here in the United States. I think we need to have a discussion about what's the standard we want for public information on chemicals. What needs to be disclosed? Should that information be tailored to specific uses? How are we providing the public the right tools to interpret that information? In terms of the basis for governmental action, we need to have a clear discussion on how the government decides when it needs more information, and then how it goes about executing on those decisions. This is a key issue in TSCA reform, one that we'll be coming back to. I think another area here is there is an alternatives assessment program under EPA's Design for the Environment effort. Several states, notably California, have adopted, in California, the Safer Consumer Products Regulation does have an alternatives assessment program. And we need to think about how those types of programs, what type of information they're going to produce and how they'll be used. I mean, alternatives assessment is a difficult process. We've been doing risk assessment for 35 or 40 years. It's still difficult. Alternatives assessment, life cycle assessment will also be difficult areas we need to address. So let me conclude by just focusing on, in terms of general chemical regulation and come back to TSCA here. I believe that the Chemical Safety Improvement Act that was referenced earlier today, the Lautenberg-Vitter legislation to reform TSCA, is one mechanism to enhance the flow and availability of information on chemicals. It does provide EPA some new authority to help them get over the current burden or hurdles that are there to force the generation of new information. Requires EPA to make these decisions solely on the basis of health and safety considerations, not on the basis of cost benefit, but solely in terms of health and environmental aspects. It also mandates upfront substantiation of confidential business information, significant change from current law. And I think perhaps more importantly to the theme that kind of went through some of the earlier discussion, it forces reporting and to enhance, to draw a better picture of how chemicals are moving in commerce in the United States. So besides having manufacturers required to report, processors would also have reporting requirements here. I think my final point would be, given the breadth of information sources out there, the purposes to which we can put chemical information, I think the key point is not to vest in TSCA the requirement to provide all information on all chemicals for all purposes. I think we have to look at TSCA predominantly as a mechanism to regulate the industrial production and use of chemicals, and we'll still have, at least in this country, a statutory regulatory regime that looks to regulate specific uses beyond that. I'll look forward to the discussion. Thank you.